Good morning. I'm going to talk indeed about program in the city, and it's wonderful to be here after the speakers that just were here before me, because I start where they left it off. Smart cities. We know the narrative. The narrative is one about ICT. The narrative is one about self-driving cars. The narrative is also one of Rio de Janeiro with its control room. These are component parts that we find in any smart city narrative. And there is, of course, the counter-narrative, can we say, of the smart citizens, the people that are smarter than the governments, that outsmart corporates, and that should be enabled. The energetic society that was referred to earlier as an expression of the collective creativity of people. I personally find that an interesting discourse, and here is how cities respond to it. They try and relate to what people can do using ICT and helping to improve public services. But I also do have a worry, and that worry is that we may be caught in a dichotomy of big versus small. And it is interesting, and if I'm not a scientist, because in English that would refer to you being a natural scientist, I'm certainly an academic. And I have traveled quite a bit through the disciplines in the years behind me. And one of these things that strikes me, that we sort of seem to replay a debate that we've had several times since the 1970s. For instance, the debate that we had in the early 1970s when everybody was thinking about nuclear power. You remember nuclear power was going to be too cheap to meter. And there were those who said, well, yes, but it comes with a big security risk. And there were these others that said, well, it needs to be small and beautiful. That dichotomy is obviously the one that we were just narrating in the debate before. So the idea that there's a big security is sure, there's a big security risk in anything. And of course, small is much more beautiful depending on your perspective, of course. But I think that we need to be careful about how we talk about smart cities, because it's so damn important to get it right. There is a claim in the room when we talk about smart cities that we must get it right. And these are three master narratives. I'm going to rush through it. It's the urban age, 50% of the people live in the urban areas, and yes, there are going to move quite a few people more to the urban areas, so the cities is where it has to happen, in particular because there's a terrible environmental crisis. We need to reach a 2-degree target, and we better get that right in 2050. But that's difficult, not only because we have 9 billion people on the planet, that's our estimate, but we have 5 billion people in the middle classes, and people in the middle class buy refrigerators, buy cars, and also tend to travel further for their touristy expectations. They buy their Prada, not on the same continent, to show that they are indeed the upper middle class. And so that's the difficulty of the environmental crisis. And indeed, it is not Amsterdam that's going to create that environmental crisis or solve it. It is, of course, the developing world that is going to be a massive consumer of resources. And that's going to hit us. It's going to hit us in a very big way, because if you look at the prices over the last century of resources and commodities, they have gone down because we are so efficient. But now we see in the last decade these prices go up. They go up in a big way because there's so much building activity, there's so much consumption activity elsewhere. Now, if that's not enough, we have a crisis of governance. After Copenhagen or after the WTO failures on a row, we know that the cockpit politics no longer works. We have scaled up politics from the local to the national in the 19th century. We've scaled up politics to the global in the 20th century, and now we know that game is over. The cockpit politics doesn't work, politics fails. And guess what? There are those intellectuals that say cities may be stronger than states. So Benjamin Barber is on his global tour, this time not with Jihad versus McWorld. This time it is about the mayors being the pivotal politicians of the 21st century. And he was, of course, predated by Arjun Appadurai, for instance, sociologist, arguing the same sort of argument that cities might be a more fundamental unit in politics. So smart cities are the solution. They are the solution to the urban age, to the environmental crisis, and to the crisis of governance. Indeed, the World Bank says smart cities can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 7.8 gigaton in 2020. Well, for your non-scientist in the audience, that's about sort of the equivalent of what China emits. And if you're in that league, then you're in a serious position. However, I can make that sum, but can I also deliver on that sum? That's a different matter. Because obviously, if you make a sum, if we would all do the right things immediately, yes, you could come to that figure. But who believes that installing smart city technology will bring us anything in terms of reaching a 220 target? Who believes that? Okay, so you all disagree with the World Bank. Is this story therefore too good to be true? Is smart cities as a proposition too good to be true? We need to think about that because we need to get it right. So let's have a look and think about what a smart city is anyway. And I'm part of my academic credentials are in discourse analysis because I take language seriously. I take language seriously because it's not the hardware that drives the change, it's always the concepts, the classifications that drive change. And if you look then, for instance, it is a very simple sort of word cloud type of application. This is not, has nothing to do with academic discourse analysis. You see that some words stand out and other words don't feature. That's the case in the global discourse, and that's also the case when you look at the Amsterdam documents. So keywords are efficiency, infrastructure, system, energy, data, information. These are important words, and I will say that if there's one big thing that we have to get right, it is the infrastructure issue. So I'm not belittling this, but I'm missing a few words. And that's important to now get right, and that's the story of programming the smart city, because language organizes issue into politics and organizes others out. And it's an old political science dictum from Schatzsnyder of the 1950s that I apply to language. So in language, you organize yourself. That's what governments do. Never forget that. Policymakers change the world through language because then language changes infrastructure. That's the order in which these things tend to happen. So I regard for the moment smart city as a discourse, and as a discourse that aims and pretends to solve global problems, bringing an urban solution, and that's something that in my work with Mark Swilling we call algorithmic urbanism. So it's the urbanism that is now possible, as we were just told also in the previous panel in a very reflective way, by using ICT, by using data. That's a new sort of urbanism. It's a different urbanism than the urbanism of bricks. But ultimately I will say that the urbanism of bricks is the one that counts. So let's for a moment reflect on what then urbanism is, because that's what we need to have in perspective if we talk about cities. We cannot allow people who know a lot about ICT to talk about cities without that debate being embedded in urbanism, because urbanism is one of the most powerful social theoretical traditions we have in our sort of academic vocabulary. And I'm going to really give just a footnote from that library of urbanism, and it is obviously the one about modernism in architecture and in urban design, because it tells us such a lot. So here's an intellectual, a Swiss man that changed his name for it to sound better. That's a habit that architects always have. And who wants to be known as Remco, right? So here is this man that calls himself Le Corbusier, and he invents this idea based on the premises that city life should be more healthy, more social, and just better quality of life. And he has this dream of a city that he then sort of sees built. In the Netherlands, this wonderful openluchtschool van bij Duiker is a fantastic example of indeed applying that technique to the city. This school where my mother went to actually. Isn't it wonderful? It's a dream come true. Intellectuals making the environment better. And this is an example that actually worked, Stuyvesant in New York. And I show it because many of the other examples obviously did not. This is the Prit Ego development that was bombed before we more or less started build the Bijlmer. It was a city development, a technology really, that was automotive, one size fits all, expert-led, fossil-based, politically corrupt, and learning only through crisis. We don't want to get into that situation. Again, this looks lovely. It was wonderful thought of in terms of public domain, allowing people to have the garden in the city, and this is, of course, what we did to it. And ladies and gentlemen, we cannot afford to do that again. We cannot afford to use all the cement, all the water, all the steel in the new cities that are now being built and do it wrong. We must not deliver on CO2 emissions. We must deliver on concepts that can help us save the world. Because this is the reality in China. This is the reality in China which follows the modernist track of using a fossil-based urbanization. And this is what just happened earlier this month. A new building, fortunately not populated yet, it just toppled over. I mean, in terms of basic construction, this is building too fast. This is definitely not smart. So let's say stop to that sort of urbanization. But when we continue our debates later on, let's not forget that what we dream up here should be of a global importance. Because more than half the world population lives in this little circle that I've shown on the screen. And our solutions must be meaningful also in that context. And that is where I think that Europe and Amsterdam, Berlin, Toronto, these cities and their intellectuals can be game changers. That should be our ambition. So let's stop this 100 years of intellectual history that led to the demise of the products that we thought were good. And let's please reinvent the city. I think we can say without pretense that's the task of the century. And we should be living of that responsibility to make that come true. But let's be smart. Let's do it differently. And therefore, let's reincorporate social theory. James Scott, Yale University, has analyzed why many of these big schemes, and smart cities seems to be a big scheme, went wrong, why they failed. These things we should take into consideration when we conceptualize the new. Charles Sparrow, a wonderful book on normal accidents, on the nuclear technology. Why did it go wrong? Why did 3 Mile Island happen? He says it was because it was a tightly coupled technological system. And the single most important lesson from that book was develop loosely coupled systems. Loosely coupled systems that allow you to constantly learn and readjust, never buy something big. But ladies and gentlemen, we need to know that also because there is such a big task ahead. And if there is one word that I want you to remember from this talk, it is the word default. Because my argument is that we run on default. We run on default, and we can capture it in a few pictures. We can extend this system. We can indeed extend the idea that prosperity is one in which you eat bigger and bigger slices of meat. But that sum, we can definitely not get into this 2-degree target world in 2050. And here this fantastic medieval structure that we invented in the 20th century, which is to cool heat. So first you generate energy and then you cool it. So how bizarre have we become in our last century that we don't use the energy that we generate? Or the ultimate luxury of traveling further and further with more and more people. Can we think of things that relate to a value change that can help us solve these public problems? How can we do that? So the question then is, do we want to make the existing system more efficient, or do we want to create a new value set that can create a new one, a new system. Do we want the urinoirs in a place like this to have a sensor that shows when we have been there so that they flush the toilet? Or is the point of using potable water in a flush toilet just a wrong proposition? That is the discussion. Is it about more efficient systems of the same, or is it about a different system? I use that example because somehow that is the one that people keep remembering. It's not that I jammed it up when I was standing there. So here are two ways in which you can think about default. So our lives aren't dominated by decisions, but by non-decisions. We think we are, because we are enlightenment beings, we think we decide on things. But it's an illusion. Most of what we do is actually based on non-decisions, on the routine. You try and live your life in terms of decisions. Definitely your family will run away from you. When you want to decide on everything every moment, that's not what you do. And on an institutional level, you see something similar. So we're not choosing things, we stand in lock-ins. That is the virtue of bureaucracy, obviously, that you routinize things. Otherwise, you couldn't provide any service. But there's also a risk, because if the default is wrong, you can't get it right. We need to see as the programmatic goal to get that default differently, to get it on the right track. And then I think if we can get that right, then this smart city proposition may be able to deliver partially on these three grandiose goals that I sketched in the beginning. Now that is what Mark and I call decoupling. And we work in the United Nations International Resource Panel to work on propositions for a city-level decoupling. What should these cities do to decouple? And that's all about infrastructure. That's ultimately not only about ICT, it is about all the other infrastructures. It is comparable, I suppose, to the sanitation movement in the 19th century, when the Victorians started to install the sanitation infrastructures because they were affected so much by diseases like cholera and the like. But that infrastructure is now 200 years old. We need to sort of step up. We need to reorder our whole sanitation system because it does the wrong things for us. It's a flow, it's not a circle. And why we think that that is such an important programmatic component is that cities that don't get that right become a financial liability, because ultimately they will have to get it right. If they don't get it right, the World Bank has become interested in this precisely because of this, because then they have a problem upstream, if you see what I mean. If they don't have a story about CO2, about nutrients, about waste and how to get nutrients out of waste, then they are a liability. You don't want to invest in these city governments. If they get it right, however, then the World Bank thinks that they are a credible government, and then they can get their loans. So what we are going to see in the next decade are these sort of flowcharts, urban metabolisms, where you see what you do. Where do we use all the energy for? Where do we use all the water for? Where do we use our food? How do we waste it? How can we avoid food waste? These are the elements of the 21st century city story. And these things are already there, right? We are well on the way, but I think that many of the cities, also in Amsterdam, we do not have that in perspective, let alone that we have a system to reduce that metabolic flow. So it's nice that in the International Architectural Biennale in Rotterdam, this is precisely the metabolism, is the central topic of discussion, and we as PBL will definitely contribute to that, showing that this is the agenda for the years to come. So infrastructure sets defaults, and it does that in two different ways. It does it on the one hand because the infrastructure influences your daily routines. So if you go here, it's often easier to take the car. Amsterdam is a bit atypical. Here you can also take a bike, although it's very dangerous. But not as dangerous as in London, which is a nasty reality, that we still allow people to be killed on the street. There's a hard infrastructure, which you can tease. And I think one of the elements of change is teasing people with default. So if you go into a hotel where, this hotel is a wonderful exception actually, most hotels where the conference facilities are on the first floor, you ask, how do I get there? They say, there's the elevator, is the escalator. But here you can come by stairs. Most hotels are built where the default is to go by electricity up, where at the same time we complain that we get too fat. So we can actually try and change the defaults in little daily habits and tease the organizations to get it right for us. But cities can do more because there's software in infrastructure. So if you, for instance, want renewable energy to be generated and you allow citizens a feed-in tariff, you guaranteed tariff for producing renewable energies, they fly. So what's the problem in Germany? It's not that there's a lack of policy performance. The problem is that too many people started to produce renewable energy. So where the Netherlands has a 4.2% of renewable energies at the moment, the Germans are hitting 25 and are going for 40. And that's not because the government is organizing it, is because it facilitates it. It's organized the feed-in tariff. So software is what policy making is all about, and hardware is what governments are all about. These are two aces that governments have in their hands, and they should be well aware of the responsibilities that come with that. So we talk about programming the smart city, and obviously this is something we need to extend. I just plotted a few things on using the literature on a list. So it's definitely about resource use and climate change. But we also want the smart city to improve quality of life. We wanted to help good spatial planning. I think Barcelona is doing a fantastic job at the moment in using indeed the smart city for spatial planning. To create also more resilient economics. The idea that you can actually afford that a firm collapses because your whole working force is so well organized that it can always find new jobs. And let's not forget social justice and inclusive development. And if there is still one track in global politics that I find is worth our attention in the environmental domain is the sustainable development goals that are now being written. And you will never see a sustainable development goal at the moment without it including this idea of inclusive growth. And I think that's right. But for us, a question this afternoon, I suppose, would be, are we going to deliver on these big issues, or are we sticking to the nice to have? Because I think it's tempting, and I like gadget. I'm an absolute gadget man. But these things are nice to have. But there are things we need to have. And how do we organize those? We must not forget about the gadgets, but we must definitely not forget about the metabolism either. And now it gets stuck. How can that be, dear fellows from the technology? Can you give me the next slide, because the machine gave up on my talk. Can you give me the next slide? And in good Koolhaas fashion, I will then start to shout, next! Can you give me the next slide, please? Okay, I got it. Okay, now we got two. It works again. So how do we do this? Because I think this is an in-group discussion, as was pointed out, and we need to extend it. You want citizens to be part of this new idea of resilient 21st centuries, and that can work. We can make that work, and it's very risky. There are a few New Yorker citizens here. I'm going to say something about New York, which I like, about what happened in that city, and it is what Janet Sedek-Kahn did, because I think she understood so well the symbolics, the cultural in this whole smart city debate. In a minute. This is a Dutch way of showing people your new priorities. So why do bicycles always have to take the second to any car crossing? So here in the south of the Netherlands, we now have a first fietsrotonde. So that's where bicycles have it for themselves. I mean, this is meaningful point about this is the new priority we want to set. We didn't actually prioritize. This is a Dutch solution. We allowed them both to flow, right? So to set the default the other way, of course, you want the bicycles to have their way, like pedestrians, for instance, in Tokyo at some points have right of way, but this is the Dutch. We never want to harm anybody, so we could organize it, we still had the money. But here's what Janet Sedeka did with far less money in this domain, when she wanted to show that New York was doing a serious job of connecting environmental politics to quality of life. And here are a few components, and they could not have worked without a smart city. Because what she did, she overnight pedestrianized Broadway. Overnight, that could be done because she was very low on costs, and she said it was going to be temporarily. If she had said this was going to be permanent, she would have been in a law case against all the lawyers of Manhattan, and that would definitely not have worked. So it was temporarily, therefore nobody could object, and what she had in her policy theory, as we people from public policy would say, is the estimation that if people would start to experience this new reality, they would start to like it, and a new vested interest would start to build up. And that is, of course, precisely what happened. And she was clever to use ICT because she monitored very precisely how much the shopkeepers earned, because they were the first to complain, and their revenues didn't go down, the traffic accidents definitely did go down, and the taxis found alternative ways, and therefore the quality of life propelled a CO2 policy, because nobody is going to go for CO2 policy. That's a scientism, but we need to have CO2 policy, so we need a symbolic layer that people understand, and quality of life is definitely something that people understand. And of course, if the idea works, it spreads, and here you see what they then do in derelict neighborhoods, and then it's only waiting for little shops to use that space in a better way. So if I conclude my talk, I think if we want the social, and the social I understand as us, to prevail over the technology, we need to make serious work of that program, the programming of the smart city. We need to also make sure that we understand that infrastructures are the big trick. They set defaults. We have a 21st century task, but we have 20th century defaults. They lead us in the wrong way. They keep us in the fossil energy economy. They don't deliver on the smart cities of the future. So make sure these defaults deliver what you want them to achieve. Spot lock-ins. I mean, governments, for sure, in Amsterdam, I dare say, indeed, even more than a normal government, has experienced ICT catastrophes. And you tend to get locked in, because once you're in a system, you can't opt out. So loosely coupled systems that allow you to modular exchange your infrastructure, that's a learning system. Allow the learning to constantly take place. There is no set solution for the 21st century. You need to keep on learning, otherwise your innovation doesn't go fast enough. So spot these lock-ins and avoid new ones. And finally, we must rethink education. We must now educate the people that know how to deal with big data, but that also know about governance, that know about urbanism, and that know about democracy. These issues, all these issues need to be brought in one bowl. And that cannot be in one person. But that is where the next generation of true 21st century academics could really find a proposition that leads them to their lives and gives them the perspective. And that is something I think we want to do, and then a change might be just around the corner. I thank you for your attention.
Maarten, thank you. If you want to wait 1 or 2 minutes, thanks for this very inspiring and energetic 70-slide talk. Probably it's one of the most inspiring 70-slide talks I've ever seen, actually. Maybe we can take one or two questions. I can imagine, I mean, loads of things being said, I mean, especially on the sides with conclusions. Maybe start, is there somebody from the spatial planning department of the city in the room?
I see a few.
They're very shy, aren't they? Over here as well. What would you say when you hear this type of coupling loose systems and want to have the social prefill? Is this in the DNA of the planning of our city, or is this... Is there a delta? No, sorry, it's over there.
Yeah. Well, I wrote down that quote of the lose systems, and I think we are really trying and experimenting with that, and there. But now nice examples.
You can think about it for a while.
Yeah.
No problem
Let
at
me
all.
think about it.
But it's in the way you think in your DNA. I mean, this conclusions basically.
Yeah.
But maybe there's also somebody in a room who has written down disagree dot and then a few bullets. Everybody agrees with Maarten because it will make your life easy, probably.
Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Bevan from Eurocities, and I was pleased to hear this emphasis on infrastructure, because I think, you know, we had Dan Hill to our conference a couple of weeks ago in Ghent, speaking about smart citizens. And we're shifting the balance of the debate on smart cities to citizens, I think, understandably, but I think he himself, you know, admits that there's a sort of hipster urbanism about all this, that's, you know, empowering the citizens, and we come up with solutions like, you know, street restaurants and casual approach to taxis, which actually create risks for citizens, and that in terms of food safety or getting mugged in a cab, you know, you do want to avoid that. So there are still quite important roles for city administrations, and the infrastructure, hard and soft, in terms of licensing, for example, are really important elements of that. And it's, you know, I think it was useful to hear that, you know, let's focus on providing that infrastructure in a way that, you know, is open to the future, and we can allow those sort of spaces within that provision. But the responsibility is still very strong, and it's still very there. So I was pleased to hear it.
Glad to hear you didn't disagree.
Everybody seems to agree. Maybe
Chair,
somebody.
Yeah, of course. What is that?
These are very big notions we hear, and but very inspiring from Maarten, but also hearing the speaker before me, and the government trying to make a change, but there are also a lot of people that have been working there for a very long time. Can you give something to touch? How can they do it? Because when we hear a story like this, we all want it, but how? Which is very difficult for people to change.
Yeah, well, I think that actually in the panel just before, we touched on that issue. So my argument is this is still a discourse, so it's discursive, but it's getting institutionalized. That's when you have to start to get worried. You need to institutionalize, but then you have to get it right, you see. So this is the time to have these sort of debates. And policymakers should be here and should help each other. And we as academics should definitely facilitate that thinking and help draw up those programs. Because policymakers are under tremendous pressure of time. Politicians that want their goals to be achieved. And they definitely not have the time to write these programs. So it is reflective meetings that can facilitate that. And wonderful, it can travel. We don't need to invent it ourselves. We may copy and paste it from wherever. Unfortunately, there are many sort of horizontal learning circles that we can use. But if we only agree on the need to be more precise about the public goals of a smart city, then I would be already pleased.
Maybe that's some great food for thought for the working session this afternoon to address a few of these topics as well, and not only talk about tangible solutions, but also think a bit about the models. I think big hand for Maarten. I think
Thank you.
Food for thought for everybody. Thank you. Thank you.